Okay, hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and very excited to have our final presentation of the 2025 calendar year. Before we begin, I'll just give a quick overview of where this series arose from. As with many things of the last 5 years, this emerged out of the effects of the COVID pandemic and the lack of opportunities for recent PhDs and emerging scholars without tenured positions to be able to present their work. And so we initiated this webinar format as a way to showcase research presentations from international scholars with commentaries from local Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community members. And we are excited to continue that tradition now for a number of years, and we'll continue to do so in the future. And today, our presentation is from Lucia Neco, who is at the University of Murcia in Spain. And the title of her presentation is Multispecies, Social Relationships, Kinship, and Environmental Care. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm just sharing my screen for you here. I hope that's good and you can see a full screen. If I can get just a confirmation, that would be good.
Yes, your screen is working, coming through fine.
Good, perfect. Thank you so much. So yeah, Alan already presented a little bit about me. The work I'm presenting to you today is a paper I'm working on, which I started when I was a postdoc at UWA, so in Western Australia. And I've been, kind of finishing this year at the University of Murcia and getting insights from the stuff that people kind of do in the minimal intelligence lab as well. So it's something that I'm working on, and I would love to hear what you think about the ideas. So a very small snapshot of what's going to happen today is that I'm going to argue that environmental care should be grounded not only in ecological relationships, but also in social relationships, such as kinship relations between humans and non-human entities. And then to support this view, and then as a second part of that paper, I introduce a framework to explore how the biological, cognitive, and the social sciences can contribute together to understanding and maybe fostering these relationships in Western societies. So my starting point here in this exploration is relational ethics. So for relational ethics, relationships themselves are taken to be at least the primary, if not the most fundamental units of moral concern. And feminist philosophy, especially through the ethic of care, has been key in establishing a focus on relationality within Western thought. As an example here, we have the work of Carol Gilligan in A Different Voice from 1982, who will kind of bring this term, the ethic of care, right, to this discussion. So as a result here, the emphasis shifts from values like individual autonomy, rationality, and pure justice to those of community, care, responsibility. There are several key features that I argue consistently emerge in this approach through various works in feminist care ethics. One of those features is interdependency or non-individualism, the idea that we are part of a web of relationships that we take for granted. This is very present in the work of Virginia Held. Another feature is relatedness. So the idea that care is grounded in experiences in social relationships, and those shape political and global issues. very present in the work of neonautings and also more recently on Eva's key case discussions as well. The third feature that I highlight here is responsiveness or reciprocity. The idea that care depends on others' responses. So it requires us to recognize the agency and the power dynamics that are always involved in care relationships. What I do in this work is argue that all those three, they ground the specific motivations for this kind of care. So first, from the recognition that we are dependent on others, we get interdependency motivation for care. From the experience of caring and being cared for, the direct normativity of our care, right? We get this lived experience motivation. And thirdly, when we respect experiences of those receiving care, recognize their agency and autonomy, that also gives us this agency motivation, all of those motivations for interpersonal care. This perspective of relational ethics in general offers a promising framework for rethinking how Western societies conceptualize and practice environmental care, because they can be expanded, right? Or expand our moral concern to include non-human entities as part of meaningful, morally significant relationships. So here, those motivations for interpersonal care become motivations for environmental care. And here I give you two examples of kind of where these motivations can be found. The first example is Leopold's land ethics. So Leopold will say that ecological interdependency and the recognition of that interdependency motivates an ethics that extends to non-human entities and the land. So when we look at ecological relations like predator-prey, pollinator, motivate us to care for these other entities, right? This work has been very recently discussed by Roberta Milson, and it foregrounds the interdependency motivation I've been talking about. Another example here is Plumwood's ecofeminist ethics, who also emphasizes ecological interdependency, but more explicitly will criticize human nature dualism and will argue that non-human entities are fellow agents, right? So here we can see not only the interdependency motivation for care, but also the agency motivation for care. What I think more generally these discussions of environmental care still lack is a clear focus on the specificity of kind of the actual dynamics between humans and non-humans, or among humans or among non-humans, as well as kind of an explicit acknowledgement and respect for how non-human entities interact with one another. So in other words, we are missing the lived experience motivation. But one approach that do that, or that does do that, that brings lived experience to the forefront as a motivation for environmental care is Donna Haraway's multi-species kinship ethics, right? Haraway begins explicitly discussing this framework in her The Companion Species Manifesto from 2003, that is right here, where she explores her relationship with her dog Cayenne, who is in the picture, and generally the relationship of humanity with dogs, right? She presents this as constitutive relations, so ones in which both humans and non-human participants are mutually transformed through ongoing interaction that can result in those kinship bonds, right? So for Haraway, kinship is not confined to genealogical ties, but it will involve intentionally forming bonds with, and she takes the idea from Edward Kohn, or this word, right, with odd kin. So kin that are not genealogical kin, right, which will include non-human animals in this, or non-human entities, not only animals in this discussion. So the idea here is that by expanding our kinship ties beyond our traditional family units, right, we also expand our capacity for care and cultivate what Haraway terms responsibility. So a practice of attentiveness and responsibility within this multi-species word, which it's more explicit on is staying with the trouble. So a more recent work. But here, this idea is not just kind of an abstract idea, but this practice of responsibility is a very, and she uses these words, a very embodied and enacted in daily practice. So one of the things I want to argue then, using kinship ethics or Haraway's kinship ethics as a case study here, is that we can enrich our framework of environmental care more generally when we include social relationships. And to do that, we need to kind of, through lived experience, right? Through the motivation of lived experience. And to do that, we need to kind of look at those two relations and how they are a little bit different, right? So let's start with ecological relations. So since ecology focuses on the relationships between living organisms and the environment, ecological relations are part of those complex webs of interactions, right? Where changes in one or more elements, such as the population of particular species or the health of water or soil sources, affect many other beings and environmental processes. Ecological relations are also very important to highlight the diverse functions species perform and the similarities across ecosystems where different species or populations can fulfill comparable ecological roles. And a good example here is pollination, for example, how white pollinators here were shown by Garrett Bowdy and collaborators to enhance crop yields worldwide, independent of their species. So the function of being a wild pollinator specific to kind of local context here. But because of this focus on population, community, ecosystems, so those kind of broad categories, conservation strategies have tended to prioritize broad demographic responses and the preservation of genetically defined evolutionary significant units, or even things like ecosystem functions, right? However, as discussions in care ethics reminds us, and I hope you still have that in mind, the importance of lived experience, kind of a direct interaction, right, cannot be set aside when we are developing a concept of relational responsibility and decision making. So these interactions are not only like models and motivation for more behavior, as I was discussing here, but also the means through which much of such behavior is enacted, right, through direct interaction. It is in this sense that I propose bringing the concept of social relationships into dialogue with that of ecological relations to hopefully improve our conceptions and practices of environmental care through lived experience. But what do I mean by social relationships? So I've been thinking about that a while. It's part of like the work I've been doing since my PhD. There's a little bit of the discussions about social relationships in this paper that I'm showing you that was published this year, actually today officially published in this pretty form. And I'm going to assume the definition I've been working with here so I can show kind of the implications of that. So social relationships here are patterns of interactions that take place among individuals within a social system over time. They vary in type, quality, intensity, according to the identities and histories of those involved. It's a very big sentence, but I think examples help a lot. So they are preferred associations like friendships, they are parental partnerships, kinship ties, hierarchical relations. They kind of highlight the fact that individuals interact differently depending of who they are interacting with and what kind of experience they had before, right? This definition of social relationships is inspired by anthropological methodology. So bring that to like a bigger discussion about what sociality means, right? And in this way, it brings a lot of kind of an active engagement when we are identifying social relationships. But I am quite clear about how they are shaped by lots of biological constraints that would involve evolution, development, the kinds of bodies that are interacting and all that. Even if it requires those agents that can flexibly track and respond to interactions in this idea, right? So what do they matter when we're talking about environmental care, right? I think there are at least three advantages of including social relationships to approaches to environmental care. The first advantage is that this definition of relationships only minimally restricts the kinds of entities that can form them and consequently be part of a social system, right? So it allows us to recognize and, when appropriate, foster inter-individual social relationships, while also acknowledging that some relationships do not and need not include us to be ethical. It's mostly enacted through those relationships, not only among humans, but also across other entities that participate in relational frameworks. This approach foregrounds an idea of social interdependence, let's say, as a core ethical concern here. And that will contribute to the ecological relations that we've been talking about. But they also, when we begin to really like pay closer attention to how this interaction occur and how can be enacted, they force us to recognize diverse forms of agency and communication that can support this care, right, in an effective care. And as we already talked about, central to care is the ability to perceive the needs of those being cared for and their response to the care, right? So failing to acknowledge how there is a diversity of those needs and responses risk impoverishing our ability to respond to it or our responsiveness, right? And can desensitize us to power dynamics that become particularly visible in multi-species contexts, which is something that Eva Meyer from Amsterdam discussed quite a lot on her work. Both of those advantages, they us to move beyond general principles and focus on histories and particularities of local contexts, right? and also distinct entities and distinct groups in those local contexts, right? So the idea here is that hopefully a focus on social relationships can then kind of reinforce and improve the other motivations that we've been talking about in terms of interdependency and agency as well, to result in this more effective environmental care. But obviously, one question here is what kind of relations will serve as guides to this kind of care that we want to build here? Because not all social relationships will be good relations, right? In fact, some of them are profoundly destructive. And I mean, I don't have time to talk about them, but I'm sure you have something in mind. In Haraway's kinship ethics, she draw explicitly parallels with indigenous ontologies and epistemologies, particularly in how they relate to non-human entities like plants, rivers, and the land, as models for the kind of relations we should aim to build with these other entities, right? With what she calls significant others here. And that's absolutely understandable, right? We luckily had in the last couple of decades an increase in the scholarship of indigenous scholars, right, who talked about their and we should definitely listen to them. Indigenous communities are less than 5% of the global population today, but manage over 40% of protected areas, ecological intact landscapes, and that encapsulate up to 80% of global diversity. And there's a problems with that percentage, but a huge percent of global diversity that underscore how those practices are successful practices of care, right? Indigenous peoples' abilities to safeguard critical ecological zones and the diversity offers a valuable lens through which we can contemplate alternative and potentially more effective models for environmental care on local and global scales. This that I showed to you are only a small subset of authors who talk about their relational practices, which is explicitly include non-human entities a part of their social systems. As examples, we can take two quotes, one from Enrique Salmon from the Haramuri. So he says that Haramuri feel related to these life forms much as Euro-Americans feel related to cousins or siblings, and how kinship is quite explicit here in the discussion. Manulani Aluni Maya also says that relationality is basic to an oceanic worldview. It is not tit for tat expectation, but a simultaneous exchange shaped by trust, reverence, and aloha. Here's where continuity flourishes. We love our land because she has always loved us. She's our mother for a reason. Maya is a Hawaii activist and scholar as well. And the idea here is that those feelings of kinship, right, with species other than our own will animate behaviors that promote environmental health and the conservation of biodiversity. Those feelings include perceptions of belonging to nature, humility about the human place in the world, and the idea of that all living things have intrinsic value, right? And because of that, kinship is a common framework for environmental care and justice for indigenous communities. It's something that Kyle White talks about a lot, and how this framework brings values of responsibility and reciprocity that make those practices be successful, right? However, it's important to emphasize that these systems, they are distinct. Like different communities have different relationships with different entities, right? And these relationships carry with them specific epistemologies and ontologies. They are, in fact, and now I'm using a concept from Julia Tulska and some of my collaborators here, they are in fact embodied social practices. So this means that they emerge from people's ways of understanding and engaging with the world that come from what they do, right, with their bodies in daily life, not from only abstract beliefs or fixed worldviews. And if that's true, adopting or integrating one of these ontologies or a mix of them when we're talking about our relational ethics, right, is irresponsible and disrespectful, as Linda Martin Alcoff reminds us. In order to build a framework for relational ethics that is concerned about social relationships, I argue here that Western societies need to draw on our own epistemological resources to recognize, understand, and then maybe cultivate those relationships within and of non-human beings. And this can include many tools, right? The arts, the sciences, architecture, among others. That's only one problem in that, right? And I think that's how kind of the presentation changed a bit, is that when we talk about all the epistemological resources that we can use to kind of think about those relational practices and really apply social, and really look at social relationships and maybe kinship relations, there are multi-species relations, we hit a little bit of a wall, especially on the concept of kinship. So it's something that I've been studying for a while, especially when I was in Western Australia on a project that was especially looking at the concept of kinship. What happens here is that most of the tools mobilized to understand these inter-individual relations, particularly when we talk about kinship, have come from the humanities, right? So especially prominent here is the multi-species anthropology or in cultural anthropology, right? Things like Eduardo Combe or Viveros de Castro. In contrast, then, contributions that utilize all the Western epistemological tools, such as those developed within the natural and cognitive sciences beyond ecology, remain limited and are often seen as too reductionist to fully address these complex issues. This is particularly evident in the so-called new kinship studies, which highlight the performative aspects of kinship relations and the role of conscious human effort, while diminishing the significance of biological properties in generating these bonds. So just to read a quote from Sandra Benford from the Cambridge Handbook of Kinship right here. I don't know if you can see what I have here. She says, quote, "Kinship, like all the other cultural domains that have captured the interest of anthropologists, like politics, religion, economics, etc., is human-made and only appears to be given in the natural order of things." End quote. So what I think is a problem here is that such perspectives end up ignoring or overlooking non-reductive approaches to social relationships, agency, kinship in the natural and the cognitive sciences, excluding potentially valuable contributions for these fields. And this is part of my problem here, because I want this to be brought, right, to look at environmental care. So in this context, I propose one way forward with this expanded social reality framework, which I developed in my PhD. So this framework is based on the assumption that we that there is a common thread that can be drawn in the study of social systems across various species, humans and non-human. In that sense, it brings insights from the biological, the cognitive, and the social sciences, allowing for a more integrative understanding of social phenomena. In the framework, I identify three basic building blocks of social systems. So they're always formed when social units or agents interact repeatedly and dynamically, and these repeated interactions form social relationships in the long term. Part of what led me to this framework was the necessity to make sense of a huge literature in the biological sciences and anthropology that was moving away from what I call a standard social system. So in the biological sciences, animals of the same species, and in anthropology, humans as only the ones that could be really real social creatures, to include to this new literature, right, that was using the term social to characterize collective behavior in microorganisms, plants, fungi, groups of organisms, parts of organisms, and in anthropology, that I already mentioned, multi-species. Multi-species ethnographies, right? That were including other entities like forests, jaguars, insects, or mushrooms as part of social systems. So in a way, the idea here is I can show how certain fields that I draw from in the natural and the cognitive sciences can help us acknowledge and better understand those social relationships, multi-species or not, that already exist and maybe even foster new forms in which they can become possible. So how the natural and the cognitive sciences within this framework can help us maybe make this lived experience motivation more present when we're talking about Western societies. And I think the first one of these fields is the behavioral sciences, which has many tools to recognize and understand social relations across species. They draw ecology, behavior ecology, primatology, comparative cognition, cognitive ecology here. One example of an area where this is especially clear is the study of animal cultures. So the information of behavior that's shared within a community and acquired through social learning. Animal cultures are highly documented in primates, cetaceans, and birds, and we have an example here. But we also have cases that argue for cultures in insects as well. Here you can see examples of vervet monkeys and humpback whales that can learn from their fellows. These behaviors of pieces of information includes, for example, tool use, foraging techniques, vocalization, migration routes. But importantly for our discussion here, understanding culture depends on understanding social relationships and how information flows through social networks. Because particular individuals, like innovators, elders, social connectors, there's lots of words for that, play key roles in that social learning, right? So animal cultures are then especially important for thinking about environmental care, tied to social systems in local contexts, right? It's something that Breaks and collaborators have been arguing, and this is just a paper from 2019, where they propose the idea of culturally significant units for conservation, on how understanding social structure is important, and especially animal cultures here is important for conservation. But while animal cultures do exist without us, and that's part of our acknowledgement, they also exist with us, right? In fact, we humans and other living beings co-construct behaviors that can form core cultures, shared socially learned practices that emerge across species. These co-constructed behaviors shape each other, shapes each other, right, in ways that are fundamental to environmental care, because they can create what Mauricio Cantor will call inter-specific culture units in the same kind of space that we were talking about, culturally significant units here, that then become important kind of systems of relationships, right, that are important for us to preserve and think about them and have concern over. There's just a couple of examples here. One discussed in a very recent paper, developed this idea of constructed behavior. So they describe long-term human-macaque interactions, like the Japanese macaques from Bali, Indonesia. If you've been there, you probably interact with them for sure. But especially in a Uluwatu temple, so in the south of Bali, they are famous for stealing people's belongings, things like sunglasses, and they give them back only when the people who worked at the temple give them food back. And interesting enough, the workers from the temple also get tipped, right, when they kind of get those items back. So they're kind of discussing how much the workers and the macaques at those temples actually have a really long-term relationship that will affect the kinds of behaviors that are produced in this kind of system, right? Which include, foraging tactics, but also conflict management strategies in this sense. But one thing that I want to focus actually, and the coolest example, is this example of human-dolphin interactions in the south of Brazil, in Laguna, where fishes and dolphins synchronize their foraging. This coordination boosts the fish's catches and increases dolphin survival. So cool about new research is that you also have videos about how things work. So here's the video from this paper from Mauricio Cantor and collaborators, where they show how this synchronous dolphin-fisher interaction works. So I think it's very self-explanatory. We see a dolphin queuing to the fishes. They go close to the fish school, and then the fishermen throw their nets. And a successful behavior occurs when the fishes respond to the cue successfully and throw the net at a specific time, right? I think you're probably not hearing the noises because I'm not sure if I shared my sound, but there are also sound cues that are sounds here of this interaction, right? And what they found in this paper is that these comparative dolphins have higher survival rates, 13% greater than non-cooperating dolphins, because they have more access to food, right? And then they will argue that this is an interspecific cultural unit. And just quickly read a quote from this paper. So, quote, local conservation actions targeting the maintenance of foraging synchrony between artisanal fishers and comparative dolphins could prevent the extinction of these dolphins. Humans and wildlife not only encourages their coexistence, but also emblematic of how the conservation of culturally significant units that we already mentioned advances the conservation of biodiversity. End quote. So the idea here is that there's so much work, I guess, and with those examples, that so much work starting and already existing on those relationships that could inform how we do environmental care, and it's still very much not be taking into global conservation efforts here. And it's quite interesting on how this work can be even improved when we think about multi-species ethnography. So bringing social sciences again to this discussion, right, can make a better picture of how those social relationships are developed and can be preserved in the way and safeguarded in the way that they talk about. So moving from the behavioral sciences, this framework also takes seriously the agency of non-human beings. So because identifying these relationships are concrete and complex at the level of social systems rather than only at the level of the population and ecosystems forces us to recognize diverse forms of agency and communication, as we talked about, right? If we want to perceive those needs, we want to be able to identify the diversity of those needs. This is precisely what kind of the macro level analysis of ecological relations tends to overlook, but it becomes more vivid when we're talking about social interactions. So, and here, when we're talking about agency, we can even move beyond a very zoocentric view of agency that it seems to be more accepted, but also even to potentially recognize agency in plants and microorganisms as well. So something that we can talk about and then take into consideration what agency is really and what it can do, right? Can attend both to its diversity and its limitations in interspecific or multi-species interactions here, and even take seriously concerns about anthropomorphization. The framework here then, because of what I'm saying, right, obviously relies on biogenic approaches to cognition, mainly through the work of Pam Lyon, that reframe cognition as a biological function, as well as 4-year approaches to cognition, in which cognitive processes are constituted by the body's interactions with its physical and social environment. So here we can take seriously the notion of embodiment, situateness that are inherited in these relations and are mentioned in many multi-species ethnography work, and stop relying on kind of internalist or neuronal views of the mind, right? How do they do that? How does approaches do that? Well, first they move beyond human and central nervous systems models of cognition. So instead of emphasizing abstract reasoning or consciousness, they highlight how cognition emerges to bodily interaction with the word, revealing nonverbal forms of communication that can be essential to sociality. They also highlight shared forms of knowing, like shared sensory motor capacities, for example, that can help us understand interspecies attunement in those relationships, and also recognize the role of the environment, right? Highlight how environments scaffold social interaction, allowing cohabitation and coordination among species. And then if we have an approach like this, we can start maybe going further from our comfort zone and talk about maybe plants as social beings. And this is something that obviously I've been thinking about in the Meet Lab because of the work that is being done here, and how much we have first researching plant science on how remarkable complexity of the plant behavior is, right? And this includes integrated adaptive responses to the environment, coordinating physiological behavioral responses across multiple distributed systems, even without a central nervous systems, right? and things about plant intelligence and plant cognition, including things like learning and memory, right? Anticipatory behavior, decision making. Obviously, a particularly important dimension of this research, which is the focus of this slide here, concerns the possibility of understanding plants as social entities, right? Since increasing evidence show that plants engage in complex interactions with other plants and organisms, and this includes chemical, electrical, and bracketing mycorrhizal networks, right? They exchange information about herbivore attacks or resource availability, environmental stresses, and the idea here is that these processes can mediate plant cooperation, involve forms of social learning among individuals and their groups, and might even lead to collective strategies resembling division of labor within plant communities. This is all a question, right? But it does push the boundaries of thinking about relations that maybe we cannot completely grasp, right? But that can be part of our notion of environmental care. And also, again, opens the possibility of talking to the literature on multi-species ethnography that already recognizes or talks about agency in plants, for example, and microorganisms as well. There's a lot of things going on, but sometimes the notion of agency is very vague, it's very abstract. It doesn't talk about what agency actually do and how can it be realized and the limits of that agency. So I can see all this kind of literature on agency more broadly, and obviously how plants push our boundaries in this way, important for doing that connection together. But then finally here, how can these literatures help us understand the idea of kinship specifically that is prominent in Haraway's work and in many indigenous relational practices? Here I draw in this point from the work of Professor Rob Wilson, who sponsors a progenitive view of kinship, particularly because it combines the biological, cognitive, and social perspectives that I have already been including in my work, right? The idea here is that kinship relations necessarily involve intra and intergenerational ties. So kinship ties are genealogy generating, so they are tied to reproduction in many different ways, right? That doesn't mean that it endorses a view of kinship that depends on the traditional family unit, because it is part of the discussion here. But on the contrary, it actually defends a flexible view of kinship by adopting a homeostatic properly cluster approach to the concept. If you want to know more about it, I can talk later. But the idea is that to understand kinship and to look for kinship, we obviously need to understand the evolution and development of those relations, but also how culture and technology shapes the relationships that humans and non-humans, here primates, have. So in doing this approach kind of bridges anthropological and biological views of kinship without reducing one to the other. In this way, it can also accommodate multi-species social relationships, including those provisional, nurturing, protective ties between humans and non-humans. And we've been preparing a paper together exactly arguing this, but also open the possibility, and I think it's interesting that this diverge a little bit from the things that I've been talking about in kinship, but opens the possibility of recognizing other forms of relations, such as friendship, for example, who are often overlooked yet crucial for diverse forms of care, multi-species or otherwise. And here, just to gather this, I have my octopus teacher friend to illustrate this idea. Anyway, there's many interactions that I could be talking about here, from interactions of researchers with many of their subjects, of domestic entities, also interactions that are more part of our daily lives, but obviously this is kind of a work that is infinite in a way, right? But I hope to have convinced you that of the importance of social relationships and how this framework can kind of help us guide through this. For my last slide, and before I finish this, I just need to quickly talk about about a few considerations on how to move forward with this project. First, I do think that this only works if we're able to acknowledge ontological and epistemological diversity, which brings much of that lived experience I've been talking about, especially when we talk about indigenous and traditional cosmologies. And the idea is that this framework can possibly increase the overlap these different perspectives can have, especially regarding the acknowledgement of these relationships, right? These are insights discussed much better by Ludwig and Ohani in their new book, Transformative Transdisciplinarity. Here, I think we also need to identify the non-overlaps or the partialities, right? The limitations of the framework I'm proposing. I don't think Western science have the tools to recognize agency in non-living beings, at least not robots, and they still have to deal with many reductionist methodologies that could be a problem for the kind of work that I'm talking about. Again, the idea here is not to absorb all the insights about all the relational practice, but to build our own, right? So possibly build them together. That can only work if we're able to recognize the power relations that exist in any decision-making space, and then avoid the single authority that Western science usually have in those spaces. So in this way, we should invest in inclusive, inter-transdisciplinarity practices, like colonizing the biosciences, as Kim Taube beautifully argue here. And ultimately, we have to set into a pluralistic notion of environmental care that will depend on the tools that we have to understand and relate to the world around and part of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. So now we're going to transition to the short commentary from Ben McMyler, who is affiliate faculty in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota and also part of our community in the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. So Ben, the floor is yours for the commentary.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you very much to Lucia for that very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to try to share some slides here. These are very rudimentary slides, I apologize, but I figured it would be better than simply why is this not working? Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yep, that's coming through great.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to try to do very simply is just raise a kind of very general worry about the project that Lucia is pursuing in the talk. And then I'll at the end, I'll just throw out an alternative position that is friendly in certain ways, but a little bit different. And the goal of this is just to hopefully get Lucia to say some more about all of these issues. So first of all, I take it the main claim here is that approaches, as she says, approaches to environmental care need to take seriously both existing and potential social relationships between humans and non-human entities. So Why do approaches to environmental care need to do this? Why must an ethics of environmental care appeal to these social relationships? Well, I take it the general idea is something like, well, social relationships are the kind of thing that can ground an ethics of care. They're proper units of moral concern. So if we can show that we have robust social relationships with non-human entities, then notions of care can get a grip in the way that we would normally expect them to get a grip in cases of interpersonal social relationships. So I take that to be the general kind of motivation, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But for now, I just want to raise a kind of general worry about how to think about that. So how exactly should we think about human and non-human social relationships? What do they amount to? Well, Lucia gives us a nice kind of account here. So these involve patterns of interaction that take place among individuals within a social system over time, varying in type, quality, and intensity according to the identities and histories of those involved. Okay, so here's the general worry. Now, on the one hand, we're going to want an account of these social relationships that isn't too thick, that isn't so thick as to anthropomorphize our interactions with the non-human world, with other animals, and with even with non-animals. But on the other hand, we want an account that isn't so thin that it's going to be unable to ground an ethics of care. We want an account of these social relationships where ethical claims about involving care are actually going to get a grip on us, okay? So the question then is just, can we do this? Can we get an account of social relationships? Can this expanded social reality framework steer between these two, steer between the Scylla of anthropomorphism and the Charybdis of something like ethical inconsequentiality? So I want to bring up just one case, one example of how this worry can come up. We could talk about the animal agency and cognition stuff, the plant sociology stuff, but I'm just going to talk about the human and non-human culture stuff as one example of this kind of issue. So Lucia draws on a conception of culture that is quite prevalent now within the kind of animal behavioral sciences. So on this conception in that literature, culture refers to population-specific behavioral traditions that are passed on between members of the population by some form of social learning. Now, importantly, the kind of social learning that people are talking about in that context typically consists of individual observational learning and problem solving that happens to take place in a context that includes the activity of other individuals. So there's lots of different kinds of social learning that people talk about in these contexts. Some of them are things like stimulus enhancement and emulation learning. We could talk about what these all involve, but they're extremely thin, okay? And in actuality, and this is well recognized in this literature, anything that resembles active teaching, even anything that resembles explicit demonstration, is actually quite rare, surprisingly rare in non-human animals, even in chimpanzees. So what social learning here is typically construed in this very, very thin way. Now, contrast that particular conception of culture from the animal learning literature with a much more traditional Taylorian kind of conception of culture that goes something like this. The beliefs, ideals, and values and practices in terms of which a population conceives of itself and is bound together. Now, that's a very different conception of culture than the one used in the animal learning literature, much thicker, okay? And importantly, both of those conceptions of culture are perfectly fine There's nothing wrong with either. They just refer to different things. Now, the former, the thin sense, clearly applies to both human and non-human animals, but the latter, the thick sense, pretty clearly does not. Okay, so how then should we understand cases of human, non-human co-culture, like the ones that Lucia talked about? Well, if we do want to talk about these co-cultures, it would seem that they would have to be cultures in a pretty thin sense. Okay, clearly we don't have anything like the Taylorian sense of culture at work here, and I would suspect something similar would have to go for human, non-human social relations. So it appears that those would have to be construed in a way that's quite thin, and importantly, quite unlike the cosmologies of many indigenous communities, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But would those then be capable of grounding an ethics of care in the way that we're hoping they are? I'm not sure. So I'd be interested to hear more about that. So here's then a potential alternative that might sidestep that problem, but at the same time be, I think, fairly friendly to a lot of the things that Lucia wants to say. So it has been, I'm sorry for all the text, I'll just read it. It has been argued, and I think there's a very good case to be made, that expanded capacities for care and compassion have played a significant role in the history of human evolution. So investment in care for the young is a common mammalian trait, becomes even more pronounced in primates in particular. And we have good paleoanthropological evidence that by at least 1.8 million years ago, the Dmanisi hominins, we have got members of early Homo that are exhibiting forms of care for others and for aspects of the inanimate world even that we don't see in other animals. And if we look at ourselves, we contemporary humans have evolved these cognitive, emotional, and behavioral capacities for investing care and meaning in almost any feature of our environment, in our tools and pets and toys and aesthetic objects, in places that mean something to us, in landscapes, all sorts of things. Perhaps indigenous kinship ethics are just one expression of these super expansive human capacities and practices of care. So maybe an environmental ethics of care could be grounded in an appeal to those human capacities themselves. Part of being human and being embedded in the world in the ways that human beings are involves extending care beyond other humans to other features of that world. That's part of what we do as human beings. And one can say that then without having to say that these capacities for care must be grounded in social relations we bear to these aspects of the non-human world. So a friendly alternative that might kind of sidestep that general worry that I brought up previously. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So now we're going to have Lucia briefly respond to Ben's comments, but let me highlight to the audience that immediately after Lucia finishes, we will have an open Q&A time. So please be formulating your questions or thinking about what you'd like to ask. And you can ask in one of three ways. You can use the Q&A function, where you can submit the question in that toolbar panel at the bottom. You also can raise your hand and verbally ask your question. I will promote you to be able to do that in the webinar, or alternatively, you can submit it in the chat and I will read it out for Lucia. So Lucia, opportunity to respond to Ben.
Thank you, Ben, so much for your comments. I think obviously your biggest worry in terms of think about social relationships as thick or thin to ground our care, right, is something that I've been thinking about a lot, exactly because I mean, between these literatures, right, of anthropology talking about social behavior and mostly biological sciences and looking at other entities that do relate in different ways. I do think that the way I'm proposing social relationships to be, it could be called a deflationary kind of way of looking at social relationships. When we're looking at social relationships in the anthropology literature and all that, it's a very first is a very abstract way of looking at social relationships, but the clear part of that abstraction, let's say, is that it needs to involve very complex features a lot of time, like sometimes even ideas, right? Concepts, ideas, things that are not in the world, or definitely intersubjectivity, so things like intentionality, consciousness, and all that. But at the same time, I can recognize those interactions that do exist, right, between humans and non-humans. But not only that, because I know, I mean, focus on this interaction. It's an easier way to ground care in a way of, because you are yourself having interactions with other other beings, right? And you can think about these care practices, but also because I think we need to recognize interactions and relations, and most importantly, things like decision making or valuation, right, in other beings that are not just humans. And I think it's important to start from a simple definition of social relationships to do that, not only to to be able to integrate that literature, think about the evolution of a specific relationships. So when we're talking about kinship relations, it's possible to look at the evolution of kinship relations if we have a different way to conceptualize them, but also looking at the evolution of all the relationships. And then there's a bit of discussion about friendship and all that. That doesn't require specifically the notion of culture. So obviously, the important things that the discussion of animal culture brings in my work is the fact that because populations in different groups, right, in different populations can be different in how they interact with the environment or how they build their own identities in not conscious in the way that culture is described in the thick concept, but in their daily lives, kind of highlight that we need to be looking at that diversity, right? If we want to care for those other beings, because that is those specific behaviors and information that are shared will influence the kind of success that they have in different environments, right? And even thinking about so something that I've been discussing with Denise Arn about horses, it's how understanding the social structure of horse groups can help us build better management practices. So while I'm kind of arguing for the social relationship thinner, let's say, concept, I don't need, and maybe I don't want to get into the culture concept specifically, because being able to recognize those specific behaviors and how they characterize these populations, it's what is important for me here. And those those populations do have clearly kind of social structures and they interact differently with each other, and that structure is important for their survival, right? So even the recognition of that will be important. So I think that's how kind of I respond to this first part. And about the alternative, I think you're right that I can maybe have a look more on this literature on how we already can expand our care to other beings. And this is interesting because that includes non-living objects as well, right? But I think there is something distinctive about interacting and even acknowledging interaction among agents, right? In this sense of things that could respond to you. Because if you care for something like a necklace, right, which is, it could be something that it has an immense history and bring memories of your family, and it's something like really important for who you are and your identity. That necklace itself doesn't respond to the kind of care that you give it to it. And this is different when we talk, for example, and that's easier to understand when we talk about dogs, right? And how they respond to the kinds of care that we give to them. And obviously, we can think about other examples, but we're still quite limited as Western society in terms of interactions and recognition of that responsiveness. So I think this is really cool to think about this, even because this is one limitation that I think, right, that my framework has in terms of non-living entities that are so important for indigenous cosmologies. So thank you for that.
All right. Thank you very much. So the floor is open for general questions from anyone who is here. So again, you can use the chat, you can use the raise hand function, or you can use the Q&A function. So questions. Well, maybe if we are waiting for a few folks to formulate a question, I have something that I was thinking about that connects with this last point, which basically maybe can be rephrased as how wide does the relationship circle go? And you were highlighting that in many cases the relational network was about expanding to other species, but obviously on this last point, then especially in indigenous cosmologies, the relational circle includes non-living entities, at least according to the way they're understood in contemporary scientific inquiry. And it seems like that would be something that not only would you potentially want to capture it in your framework, but it also would suggest some interesting additions, because as you were highlighting, there is a tendency to neglect certain kinds of sciences in the formulation of our understanding of these relations. And in fact, it would seem then like we would want to bring in potentially the earth sciences and environmental sciences as a sort of component of that, because they would speak to these entities in a way that would be distinct, say, from what you find in biology, cognitive science, and some of the other areas that you canvassed. So I'm just curious to hear you say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned even the earth sciences specifically, because there's a lot of discussion about soil in this literature and how the care for the soil is something very important in many communities, and that it's not just restricted to indigenous communities here, but also traditional community or Western communities. Again, I think there is one problem, which is a problem that won't go away, is the kind of the limitation of those communities as well when we're talking about these epistemologies, ontologies, and all those things, right? Because when I say Western societies, and that's why they are on quotes here, it is a way of limiting the epistemological tools, specifically because I'm talking about the Western sciences, right? So the only way I'm limiting Western societies here is by saying there are societies that rely on those sciences as epistemological tools, right? Or primary epistemological tools, which is important to say that there's a lot of overlap, right, of those approaches. Like we don't exist in consistent approaches on how we deal with the word, right? We actually can be Westerners, let's say, and use Western science as primary epistemological tool here, but at the same time believe in other things. And this is clear, like religion and people, even scientists, right, are part of what producing science, but also are part of other communities that have a very different framework on how they see life. So I'm saying that because this kind of blurs how we think about these approaches for kind of real life decision making, let's say, right? And that's why I'm very kind of explicit about where I'm coming from in terms of like I'm talking about the Western sciences and Western societies in this framework because they can advance those discussions. But I don't think it's something that we can just I don't think we can capture everything that is in other approaches to environmental care. I don't think our approaches will be complete in a way, right? Or capture all those elements. Obviously, we have approaches to that, right? When we talk about care, expanding to non-living entities, there's a lot of work on how cognitive tools can be important when we look at the meaning and the importance of other elements in the word. But obviously, explaining this way would never be how Indigenous communities will explain those relationships, right? So I think, I mean, is a hard discussion, I would say, in terms of saying that I think we are limited in the kinds of claims that we can make about the word unless we are very clear of where we're coming from and the kinds of assumptions that we are using to do those kinds of claims. And I think that's why it's important to be very explicit about this, let's say, ontological assumptions that we are taking when we're making those kinds of claims. And we're going to be in spaces when we're talking about decision making where different frameworks will have to talk to each other. And thank God there's people actually working on how to deal with those conflicts. And part of the work that I was talking about in terms of embodied social practices and the work from David Ludwig and Chabel Honey has to do with those spaces, right, of conflict, of when those perspectives come together and how we can maybe, and then that is one option here, co-construct claims about what those mean, right? What does it mean to care for an object in ethic of care, right? Does that give that object some kind of anime, right? When we're talking about animism here. I think it's something that we have to work out together, right? I'm sorry, it's not like a complete setup response because I still think we have to be working towards this. If I tell you a complete answer, I think we're missing out on the possibilities of this field.
Okay, thank you. Any
problem.
questions? Ben, you too could ask a follow-up if you want.
I could ask a kind of insidery question that I wasn't going to ask, and you can abstain if you want. I was just, it occurred to me in listening to some of this stuff. I so I wonder what you think about some of Tim Ingold's work that goes through a lot of similar stuff, but doesn't really come out in the same place, it seems like. So, I mean, he too is very interested in these indigenous kinship ethics systems. He's very interested in the ways in which, I mean, for him, he mostly talks about kind of, Canadian, Ojibwe, and Cree and whatnot groups, but there is this common kind of Amerindian, for lack of a better word, kind of cosmology that involves, a very different way of thinking about and relating to the natural world than we have. And so terms like animism get thrown around, and that, when Western anthropologists try to talk about that, there's a question of how misleading that actually is. But yeah, he too is very impressed by that kind of worldview, and he sees it as a kind of expression of something really important about human being in the world. But he's not someone who seems to want to then go on to find something similar in natural scientific terms, if that makes sense, which sometimes it seems like you're trying to do. So I'm just wondering what you think about all that.
I am obsessed with Tim Ingold. Thank you for this question. So Tim Ingold had phases, let's say, right? He had a very human conscious. So what I was talking about in terms of very conscious, focused view of social relationships is very it's from his work as well. But yeah, you're right. Recently, he shifts to a more relational kind of perspective of what it is. So when he talks about constitutive social relationships and stuff, he separates in the early works, he separates the objects from the subjects, right? And he's very clear how anything that is not human are objects, right? And humans has this like extra thing. Which include consciousness and intentionality, and that makes real social interactions. But then more recently, he says, no, humans are actually both of those things. And for me, that's great because then embodiment comes explicit in his work. You make yourself in your relationships, but also the tools and the things that make up humans and all that, which is interesting that he grounds that in embodiment, but at the same time, when he makes this shift, he's very against any kind of social analysis, right? Any formal understanding of social systems like social scientists would do. So we kind of missed out on how this ended up being applied to social analysis, right? So while there's like super cool insights, he doesn't engage with things like embodiment and how this could be actually enacted in real world and stuff. While he has like really good ideas on how those ontological claims even are relational, right? That we are building them together with the word, which makes total sense. Yeah, but then he doesn't talk about non-human animals as being agents only in relation to humans. So it seems like in the work, and he talks about a rock as well. I think one of the papers, a rock is the main subject. It only becomes animated in its relationship with the humans. So I think that's where we draw a line between our interaction in that way, that I don't think all social interactions or even all agential interactions depend on humans, even if obviously we're looking at them through our eyes, and then that's something that it's obvious to me, right? Um, but they can exist without our participation in it, and he doesn't admit that. It seems like because it also becomes more complicated the work, yeah. But thank you. I think yeah, that's the main difference.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note for us to bring things to an end. I want to thank Lucia for your presentation and Ben for your commentary. I appreciate everyone's time and those who were able to join us, and look out for future installments of the International Postdoc Forum in the new year. And if in the meantime you would like to see some of the ones we've done in the past, as well as this one in the probably about the next week or so, they'll be posted to our YouTube channel for the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.